Hello, and welcome to the Realness and Chaos podcast. I'm your creator and host, Janae Jackson. And in this week's episode, we're going to be talking about DEI and the workplace. So if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get into it. So, as you know, this space is dedicated to talking about the workplace, talking about how it impacts you as a worker, and about you and pursuing your purpose, how you navigate toxic work environments, and all things work related. And this is a new topic, or maybe it's a topic that people are talking about a lot recently. Maybe I'll put it that way. And the topic is DEI. I know you've been hearing about it a lot. Target has made some different changes, and that's been a big thing in the news lately. And I just wanted to clear up some misconceptions that people have about DEI and what that means in the workplace and how it impacts you as the worker. So, DEI, if you didn't know what it stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it really is an umbrella term that was introduced in the 1960s. And the term was meant to capture the ways in which your job brings awareness to the benefits of a diverse, equitable workplace that ensures everyone feels safe in that space. And so it includes a lot of things, right? It includes things like training, it includes things like education for your staff. But one thing that people talk about the most that I don't think they really understand is hiring and how it impacts hiring. So that's where we're really going to start first. And one of the first things that I really want to talk about and address as it relates to DEI is that DEI is not about hiring people of color. It's not about hiring people just for the sake of what they look like, to increase numbers in an organization of people who maybe look diverse. That's not what it's about at all. In fact, if we're talking about DEI in the workplace as it relates to hiring, I say that there's no such thing as a DEI hire. And I say that because folks who are hired in an organization, even if they may be hired under some sort of a DEI related program, they still have to meet the minimum qualifications for that job. So whatever it is that they're applying for, the educational requirements, the skills and experience, those things are still there. And those candidates who ultimately get the jobs still have to meet all of those requirements and meet those expectations. So no one's getting a free ride and no one's getting a job simply because of their race or their ethnicity. That's not what that's about. And I will say this, I think that one of the reasons why people think that that have that misconception is because years ago, I would say in the 80s, in the early 90s, maybe companies who got federal money or they got contracts or money from the federal government for part of the work that they do, maybe the federal government would implement things to say, hey, your workforce doesn't look very diverse, and if you want to keep getting our money, you need to figure out how to diversify your workforce, which means you need to expand your mind to understand that people you hire in positions need to be diverse in such a way that, how do I want to say this, that you aren't hiring people that look a certain way for a certain position. So maybe I'll start back here. I'll pull it back a little bit more. Before things like DEI were in place, companies could hire folks and they could put people into these little silos. And they could say, for example, your janitors, your frontline workers, your frontline staff, those people could be people of color. Those people that have manual labor jobs, those people who maybe the job only requires a high school diploma, those are the people that fill those positions and are often hired in those positions. But as you move up in an organization and as you look up in the leadership of an organization, it starts to become less diverse. The managers, the leaders of those companies were primarily white men. And so when people would question that, see, people would still apply for jobs, right? They would see a job, they think they apply, they qualify, and they would apply for the job. And companies would hire who they want. And oftentimes it was, as I explained, management were white males, and then your front level, your manual labor positions were people of color. And so people would apply for other jobs and companies would say, well, this was the only applicant pool we could find. So when someone would question a company to say, how come your organization looks like this? How come none of your managers are people of color? How come your managers are not women? The companies could just say, well, that's those were the best candidates that we could find, right? And they could just kind of give you this blanket answer or an excuse and say, sorry. And so what diversity and equity and inclusion did is it challenged those companies to say, really, is that true? You only can find white men to be managers in your companies. No other people are applying that are qualified for your jobs. There aren't any people of color that are applying for your jobs to be managers. There aren't any women that are trying to be managers in your companies. And so what it did is it forced them to say, you got to look at other people that are applying as well. You can't just look at a job and say, these are the type of positions that are best fit for white males, or these are the type of best positions that are best fit for people of color. Secretarial positions are better for women. Women are admin assistants, not men. So things like that, where companies kind of already had a preconceived idea of what their workforce should look like, and they hired as such. Diversity, equity, and inclusion challenge those things. Diversity, equity, inclusion says, I don't believe that this is what your applicant pool is truly looking like. You need to figure out how to maybe send out applications in other places. Are you putting your job announcements in places where people of color have just graduated? If you're looking for new graduates, right? Are you diversifying where you are announcing your job so that you get more applications of people that look differently, right? Because everybody has skills to do all of these type of jobs. And so you've got to think outside of the box. And so a lot of companies were keeping people in boxes. And that's part of a lot of the things that I talk about in general about the workplace, right? Is just how people have been put into boxes, or people can be placed into boxes by how they look, by maybe what they sound like, things of that nature. And so DEI really was in place to challenge those type of things, to say, you've got to think a little bit more about who you're hiring and how you're hiring, and even where you may be putting your announcements so that people have an opportunity to see and apply, thereby diversifying your applicant pool, and then showing you a plethora more of applicants that could be available to you and at your disposal for the position. So that's what DEI is and was about as it relates to hiring. Again, it has never been about just hiring people just because I need a person of color in this position, so I'm going to hire them. That's not what it's about. And quite honestly, that is not happening. Unqualified people of color are not just being hired in positions and being paid a whole lot of money for jobs that they are not qualified for. Quite honestly, it's very hard for people of color to get high paying positions that they are qualified for. A lot of times over the years, you will see people of color have argued that they were overqualified and they still weren't getting jobs that they were applying for, right? So that's what this was about, is to help companies and organizations understand and expand their thought process about who could be fit for a job. So that's a little bit about the hiring process. Another component and aspect of DEI, right, is about training and education. And I liken this very similarly to sexual harassment trainings that most people see in their organizations, right? You get into a company. There came a point in time in the workplace where sexual harassment was overlooked, right? Women who were maybe being put in uncomfortable positions, in their jobs, weren't taken seriously when they complained, or they could possibly be at risk of losing their jobs for complaining about these things, right? And as a result, what happened is there was more training, more education about sexual harassment, about how that's not okay in the workplace, about how you can avoid becoming a perpetrator of sexual harassment or harassing someone in the workplace. And so that's what those trainings were about. DEI is very similar to that. It's about helping your company and your staff understand not only the benefits of diversity, but about making sure people feel included in the workplace, right? So trainings about how we don't want to be dismissive of people because of their religion. We don't want to make inappropriate comments in the workplace. Let's say you are in the break room and you're eating lunch, and someone's eating lunch that is different from what you normally would eat, and it may smell different, and you may make a comment, and that's inappropriate because now you're making someone feel uncomfortable in the workplace just for being themselves, right? Hair, understanding that someone's hair could look like mine, for example, and that person still be considered a professional, right? There was a point in time, and there still are cases, unfortunately, where someone whose hair looks like mine would be considered unprofessional in the workplace. Or it would say, well, we're not going to make this person a manager because their hair is unkempt, right? Or it's not neat. And so DEI challenges people to say, this is how this person authentically shows up. This is part of this person's culture. You cannot discriminate against this person for that. You cannot make the assumption that this person is unprofessional or unqualified because their hair looks like this, right? And so it's about educating folks so that they can understand and see that these things are about expanding diversity. Really quick example that comes to my mind. I don't know if you're somebody who watched television shows back in the day, but I watched the show Living Single, and there was an episode in that show once about the character Kyle, who had locks. His hair was in locks, and I think he was like going for a promotional opportunity, and people really liked him in the workplace. And a coworker said to him, who was an African American, said, you know, you should do something about your hair because people aren't going to hire you in a leadership position if your hair looks like this, and really put him in the position of questioning himself and how he presented in the workplace to say, well, maybe I should cut my hair because I want to be able to move up in the workplace and I want to be considered for management positions. And DEI, it challenges that thought process to say, wait a minute, you can't just assume that somebody is unprofessional because their hair looks differently than yours. That's not fair. That's unreasonable. And that doesn't promote an inclusive workplace. So that's where things like that come from, and that's what that training is for, so that people can understand the impacts of their assumptions that they can make on people in the workplace, right? It's about challenging microaggressions. It's about challenging stereotypes and getting people to see that we live in a diverse world. We certainly live in a diverse country. And as such, your workplace should look similar to the places that you live in, right? So if we're talking about a city, a metropolitan city, then you would expect that the companies in those cities would look diverse because the people who live in those areas look diverse, right? You may not expect diversity as much in a place where maybe the people in the community all look the same. So then you're going to assume people are going to look like that, right? But again, we live in a diverse time, and so companies and organizations should reflect that diversity. And that's the part of the benefit and the reason why we have DEI and DEI related programs in companies and organizations. So I want to talk about why we're hearing about DEI so much now. And I think part of the reason why we're hearing about it now is because there's a lot of changes that are happening in the workplace. There are changes, of course, with every administration, people who lead the country. And so now this is a topic of discussion. And one thing that people are discussing is the removal of DEI related programs, DEI related initiatives in an organization. And we're going to talk about why those things are being removed now. So I think one of the things that people need to keep in mind and understand is that a lot of the programs that they see now that are being removed or scaled back in companies and organizations is because they probably were not permanent ideas at their inception. And what I mean by that is in 2020, and, a few years ago, there were a lot of protests surrounding police brutality, and people were asking for things to change things to change in the country overall as it relates to police brutality, how African Americans are treated by the police. And so as a result of that, while there wasn't a lot of laws and things that changed to address police brutality, a lot of companies started to create DEI initiatives. They started to do things to bring more awareness to people of color in companies and organizations, and just bringing awareness to diversity in general. And so unfortunately, right, those things were kind of a knee-jerk reaction to people's call for addressing police brutality. And so similarly to how the Black Lives Matter words were painted on the streets of cities all over the place, it faded, right? It wasn't going to be there forever. It was something symbolic. It was something that was nice. It looked really nice to do. And so that's what people did in the moment. And folks just got kind of carried in the wave. And I think these new DEI programs and initiatives were some of those waves, was part of that wave, I would say. And so because it was part of that wave, like the Black Lives Matter signs in the streets, it fades away. And so now we're at the place where it's fading away. And that's because it was never really something that was inherently important to that company or organization. It was just something that they did in the interim. Maybe they thought it would, look really great for their company. And so it gave them really great exposure at the time, and people thought they cared. And ultimately, again, if it's not part of the fabric of your organization and who you are and how you want to represent yourself, then it's not going to stay. And that's what's happening now. You see things that are being pulled back and rolled back. And again, unfortunately, that's because, to me, the idea was never for them to be permanent. If they were meant to be permanent, it would still be a part of the organization. It would still be a part of, their mission, their goals. And so they would keep these things. They wouldn't just take them away so quickly and just say, we're done with that, right? You could keep them if you wanted to. And the fact that some people don't should just let you know that it was never meant to be permanent. So I think people should keep that in mind and understand that. I think that would help you so that you don't become too emotional about this and then become hurt maybe by the fact that these companies are rolling these things back. You've got to keep these things in perspective as it relates to how you experience them and what they were meant for, right? You've got to understand what they're meant for. And that's part of what I like to do, is explain things for people so you understand what these things were really meant for, so then you can appropriately categorize it in your life, right? You don't need to be so emotionally invested in it and become hurt by it if you understand that it was never something that was really meant to be part of their organizational structure in the long term. So that's why you see a lot of things being rolled back, because these things were initially brought in for that reason. And so it wasn't permanent, right? And maybe they didn't even figure out how to weave these into their organizations on a more permanent basis. And that's why you see those things rolling back. Again, DEI is something that's been around since the 1960s. So there are DEI trainings and efforts and movement in organizations all over the place that have not changed and that will not change, and that maybe will only become more enhanced and will remain in place. Again, similarly to sexual harassment training, creating awareness to your company and your staff is still important to a lot of organizations. And so those places will still have these things and they'll still be there. But for the ones who are rolling these things back, I think that's a reason why. That's one of the reasons why. And so people should understand that so that you can move accordingly. Now, I will say, I'm not really sure how DEI turned into a conversation about hiring unqualified African American people in positions. I see a lot of people who have very large voices in platforms saying things like, when something goes wrong in a company, and if there's a person of color that's in the position or maybe running that organization or that section of the company, that person's a DEI hire. And this person maybe is not the best fit for the job. And this is how come things don't go right. And that's very unfortunate when that happens. But unfortunately, for African American people and for people of color in the workplace, they're often made to be, right, the scapegoat of things when they don't go right in the workplace, even though maybe those people don't inherently benefit from these things. If you look at DEI efforts and DEI programs, white women have benefited the most from these various programs and efforts in creating that inclusion in the workplace. But again, when the negativity is brought up about it, it's often focused on people of color. And that's very unfortunate. But again, it's often something that people of color face in the workplace. That's part of the reason why this space was even created, to talk about microaggressions, to talk about stereotypes and how these things impact people on a daily basis in the workplace, and they're often overlooked, right? People are told, well, you're reading too much into that. Oh, that's not what that is. But meanwhile, the people that are impacted still feel these things in a very real way. They're just not being taken seriously by the organization. And so that's what's happening. There was a article that was in Forbes.com that was published in May of 2023, and it actually stated that white women held nearly 19% of all C-suite positions, while racial and ethnic minority women only held 4%. Overall, white women have benefited disproportionately from corporate DEI efforts. And if you don't know what a C-suite position is, that's like a very high level management position, like CEO, Chief Executive Officer, those level type of positions. So again, overall, white women have benefited from the perspective of being women, right? And being women being given more management positions. But when you actually look at people of color, those people are not filling those positions disproportionately. Those people are not. So it's very dismissive, I would say, to those people of color who are in these positions, to say, oh, they're just a DEI hire, and to write them off and assume that the only reason why they got those positions is because of their race, when if you look at those people's resumes, they're probably overqualified. They probably should have been in a management position years ago. But through DEI efforts, they're getting more opportunities. They're actually being seen. They're actually being considered, right? Again, using the example of hair. Someone like myself, before DEI trainings and education was put in place in the workplace, a manager may think to themselves, oh, I can't hire someone who has locks as a manager. That just doesn't look professional. But through the education, they've learned, well, that really doesn't have anything to do with this person's knowledge, this person's education, this person's skill set, how they show up, how they help people, their temperament, their behavior. It's just their hair, right? So I can't really hold that against somebody, and I don't really know what they do. Or even worse, I do see that they come to work every day. I do see that they're professional, but their hair, you know what I mean? So the DEI really challenged people and companies to say, what about it, right? You've got to look at what you are asking for your applicants, what you're looking for in your person that's going to fill this position, what their education should be, what their experience is, and how it can enhance your company or your organization. Not that person's hair, not that person's religion, not the fact that it's a woman and not a man. So you really got to understand what DEI is about in order to frame it properly. Again, I'm going to say it again. It's not about just hiring somebody for the sake of being in a position. I've been in HR for over 20 years, and I have not ever seen an unqualified person of color be hired in a high-level management position just because they're a person of color. Okay? I have seen positions be downgraded for white people to be hired into positions that they didn't necessarily qualify for. I've seen positions be downgraded for folks to be in those positions. I've seen where they have been given consideration for their ability to learn, right? They can learn. I've heard the term train up into a role, and I've never heard that term being used as it relates to a person of color in a position, but I have heard that term be used as it relates to making an exception to hire a white person in a position that maybe they aren't quite ready for. And I've heard, well, they can be trained up, and that consideration isn't given to people of color in the workplace, right? It's like, well, you should be qualified. You should already have these skills. You should be ready. And so that's just not the case. And that's not what's happening in the workplace. And it is reckless, I would say, to put that out there and say that, and then thereby diminishing these people and the things that they have brought to the organization. Because honestly, when you do that, you're actually taking those people back and all those accomplishments back to the 1960s in those positions where you say, well, see, that's why people of color shouldn't be managers, because look, and that's just not fair. And that's just not true. So that's part of the reason why I wanted to make sure to really talk about DEI and talk about the workplace and how it's used in the workplace and what it's used for, because people need to know, and they need to be I would say checked if they are spreading misinformation. You should be able to, if you're aware and you know, then you could explain this to folks better so that they understand what that means. Another thing that I think is important to talk about, and it's kind of similar to that, is people talk about wheelchair accessibility, making things more accessible to folks so that they can do their jobs. And those things are somewhat related to DEI, but I would also say that's also the benefit of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? Where you say making things accessible and able for people to do their jobs, not just saying to them, oh, well, you have a wheelchair, you can't get to that space, don't know how to help you. Well, you could just make a ramp and they can roll themselves, get themselves to where they need to be. No assistance required. They could do it on their own. And so by having a ramp there, right? So that's what that's about. And that's what all of these programs have been about, is to raise awareness and to challenge the mindset that has been more prevalent in the workplace for many, many years. And so there's been a lot of efforts to make things more equitable, more fair, and so that people feel comfortable in the workspaces that they are in, so that they don't feel like, I have to look a certain way in order to be taken seriously for the roles and the jobs that I'm applying for. So, what does all this mean now for the workplace and how people are impacted by the workplace? If your job is a directly impacted DEI related position. So, say for example, you are a DEI officer or a coordinator in your organization, and now they are rolling back their efforts as it relates to DEI, then unfortunately for some people, that may be that they don't have a position anymore. But for people who are already in their various roles, usually that doesn't mean anything for you. You still are in your job, you still are there, and nothing will change. It could be that over time, the companies may start to look a little bit differently, right? So hiring may change. If no one's asking, well, how come your company looks like this? How come your makeup looks like that? That could change, right? That could change, and it could go back to something that people saw years prior where there was no diversity, where again, like I said, manual labor positions were only people of color or primarily people of color, and there were no managers, right? That could change if DEI efforts rolled back in companies, so you could see the landscape of companies looking differently. If there's no one that's looking at your applicant pool to say, how come you had, I don't know, 20 applications for people of color and 4 applications for non-people of color, and you happen to hire the non-person of color every time for these type of positions? It could be that may change, right? That diversity is not going to be there anymore, and that would be unfortunate. But that could be a consequence of rolling back DEI efforts, is people don't understand the benefit of it. People think that it's based on misinformation that they hear, and then they change how they think and they change how they move. And I think that would be unfortunate, and that would be a downfall of a lot of work that people have put in to helping people understand and expand their mindsets and their thought processes around these sort of things and what is fair for everyone in the workplace. Again, it's about making sure people feel comfortable, making sure people have the same opportunities as everyone else, right? So we all considered for a position that we apply for in the same ways that as everyone else, and there aren't any special exceptions. And so when you start to provide a lot of misinformation and you start to say things like, DEI efforts are really about just hiring people for the sake of what they look like, regardless of whether they qualify for positions, it diminishes people who are in those roles, who have worked very hard for the positions and the education and experience that they have to be in these roles, and now it's being minimized in that way. And so that's the downside of DEI efforts being rolled back. But I will say that for those companies that take these things seriously and that want them to be, a part of the fabric of their organizations, they won't change, and they will have more, and they will continue to do trainings and things like that. But for some companies, that may not be the case. So, as I always explain to people, you still have to be strategic in the workplace, right? You still have to think of yourself and see yourself as a business. You, that entity, even though you are a worker, you still need to treat yourself like a business. Your own personal goals, you need to know what those are, and you need to understand the best vehicle for which to get you there. So if there is a job that you are in and it turns out that it's not the best and most efficient vehicle to get you to wherever your goals are, then it's a lot easier for you to just detach, move on, and find something else that better fits you so that you can keep going in the effort, in the ways that you want to move. And I think overall, what this will show people is that you want to be more than a worker, and you want to treat yourself as more than a worker, because ultimately it's not your company, and the company can do as it pleases, and they can make changes if they'd like, and unfortunately the worker is at their whim. So you don't have a lot of options. You do have options in terms of moving around, right? You can take your skills and your education and you can go apply and go somewhere else. But again, you're always going to be at the whim of that company and that organization, which is why when you treat yourself like a business, you have more control over yourself and your livelihood and your destiny. So then you can say to yourself, okay, I'm a worker for now, but at some point I'm going to be a owner, or I'm going to be in this place and in this space, and this is the goal of what I want to do with my career and my life, right? So that I am not at the whim of a company or an organization. And so that's part of being strategic. You got to look at the landscape of where you are and see how things are changing. And you've got to make a decision for yourself if this is a place that you still need to be, or if maybe it's somewhere that you need to move on from. But just know that you always have options. And when you position yourself and you think of yourself and you treat yourself as more than a worker, you are more empowered to control your life in the direction, in your career, the direction that you want it to go. And so that's really the main points of DEI that I want to talk about. That is one of those are the things that I really wanted to reassure workers of, and to not be worried about these things, right? Because ultimately the company is going to do what it needs to do. And as I always explain to workers, you got to take control of your life, and so you don't want to be at the whim of these companies. You got to move strategically. When you start to pay attention to what's happening, you can make better decisions for yourself and you'll be more prepared. And so ultimately that's the goal. And hopefully this conversation and talking about this topic is helpful for you, and it would have given you some more things to think about, and hopefully help to ease maybe some of your concerns as it relates to DEI and how it could impact you in the workplace, right? So don't be afraid. You can continue to move forward, and these things will all work out for you. So again, be strategic and you'll be okay. You have your education, you have your experience, and no one can take those things from you, right? You add those things to your resume and you move on to something else that's better. And that's my hope for workers everywhere. So I thank you so much for listening. I hope you come back for more. Please subscribe, like, and share. That's so helpful, and you'll never miss another episode. If you want to follow me also on Instagram, you can. I'll have the link down in the description where you can click on it. But the name is Janae's Pen, so it's JENEESPEN. You can find me on Instagram. I'd love to hear your thoughts and any questions that you may have about the topic. Thank you for listening, and until next time, have a good day. So yeah, again, I hope this was helpful for you. I thank you for listening, and until next time, have a good day.